He sold his wife to a mob boss for $50,000. For 2 years, Eric treated Lena like his personal punching bag. But when a ruthless underground kingpin offered him $50,000 to sign the divorce papers and vanish, Eric took the money without hesitation. Lena was horrified to learn her trauma had a price tag. But Adrian Castellano didn't buy her. He bought her freedom. Watch what happens when a mafia boss falls for a broken waitress.
Picture a scene so deeply rooted in the psychology of survival, it feels almost claustrophobic. We find Lena pressed against the unforgiving chill of bathroom tiles, tasting the metallic sting of her own blood. She is trapped in the ultimate paradox of domestic terror: remain in the shadows and let her abuser erode her soul, or flee into a world that offers no safety net. You and I have likely faced moments of feeling stuck, but this is a paralyzing fight for sheer survival. Yet, the narrative twists when a stranger recognizes her silent trauma. No gentle comfort are offered, just a chilling promise that it ends now. The irony? Her savior is the city's most feared criminal architect. Sometimes, the only hands capable of pulling us from the darkness are the ones that shaped it. You can almost feel the radiating heat of the impact on her cheek, yet the most haunting detail is her absolute lack of tears. The weeping stopped months ago, replaced by the grim realization that sorrow offers no shield against violence. Instead, Lena performs a detached, clinical assessment of her own wreckage. The bruising around her eye can be painted over. The ribs ache fiercely but remain intact. Outside the door, Eric paces, his toxic rage simmering down into cowardly silence. Mocked by the canned laughter of a late-night television show, she forces herself up to face the mirror. At 26, her reflection holds the exhausted gaze of a woman who has endured lifetimes of pain. It is a quiet truth that our deepest scars are rarely the ones left visibly on the skin. In a mere 6 hours, she is expected to clock in at Romano's, trading this private hell for public servitude. Her hands betray the violent rush of adrenaline, trembling uncontrollably as she watches the blood-tinted water spiral down the drain, a grim visual metaphor for her own spiraling reality. She methodically rehearses the worn-out lie of a clumsy fall, knowing her co-worker Maria will offer nothing but a hollow, pitying glance. Lena reaches for her makeup, transforming a daily cosmetic ritual into a desperate act of concealment. She layers the foundation with heavy precision, burying the physical evidence of his cruelty beneath a flawless, manufactured mask. It reveals a tragic truth. Society often prefers a comfortable lie over the ugly, disruptive reality of suffering. Pat, blend, set. The darkness beneath her skin spreads like an ink stain, a creeping rot she desperately spackles over until a semblance of normalcy returns. Creeping back into the bedroom, she finds Eric lost in a heavy, oblivious sleep. We are witnessing the classic, suffocating cycle of abuse. By morning, he will perform the role of the remorseful partner, pouring coffee and offering a hollow, desperate apology, and Lena will accept it, paralyzed by the dread of what might happen if he stops pretending to be human. It brings us to a harsh but necessary life lesson. Accepting a counterfeit apology never actually purchases genuine safety. She curls under a thin blanket on the living room sofa, her heart racing into pure panic at every subtle creak of the floorboards. The moment dawn breaks, Lena flees the apartment. Romano's is not merely a job for her. It is a vital psychological sanctuary. Trapped in terrifying unpredictability at home, she thrives on the diner's rigid, unchanging routines. The demanding businessmen and elderly regulars create a controlled space where every variable is known. Delivering endless breadsticks or handling a returned salad offers a numbing comfort, allowing her to disappear into the schmutz. When she steps into the kitchen, Maria reads the heavy powder on her face instantly. There are no probing questions, just the silent understanding of an unspoken burden. True empathy isn't demanding the whole story. It is simply handing over the order pad so the fragile rhythm of life can carry on. She drifts through the morning shift like an apparition, flashing a hollow smile driven entirely by muscle memory. At table 9, she observes a young couple holding hands, and her mind simply cannot process the image. The concept of physical touch being tender rather than violent has become entirely alien to her. Then the lunch rush slams into the diner. Tickets fly, plates clatter, and Lena finds her escape. The intense chaos serves as a psychological morphine, drowning out the throbbing ache in her ribs. Carrying heavy, steaming plates, she feels like a functioning person rather than a hostage counting down the hours. True survival often means finding your sanctuary in the noise. She is perfectly grounded in the rush, right up until Maria frantically grabs her arm. Section 2, Table 11. Heavy hitters, Maria whispers, her voice trembling with genuine dread. The owner has just comped their wine, a gesture of submission he never extends. Looking over, Lena spots 3 men in tailored suits that whisper of obscene wealth and power. 2 of them carry that arrogant, slouching menace typical of syndicate muscle. But the 3rd man is different. He sits with a terrifying stillness, projecting an aura of control that lowers the temperature of the room. "I'll handle it," Lena breathes, approaching the table as if walking to the gallows. She knows how to manage flashy, arrogant men, smile tight, pour the drinks, and survive the shift. She clicks her pen, locking her fractured self behind a polite mask. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am Lena." The polite greeting dies in her throat the moment the quiet man looks up. His gaze locks onto hers, conducting a forensic examination of her soul. "Water," he murmurs, his voice a low, unbothered rumble of authority. Lena nods mechanically, her pen scratching aimless lines across the paper. The other men speak, but the sound dissolves into white noise. She can physically feel his scrutiny, dismantling her defenses. Catching her reflection in the glass, she confirms the bruise is perfectly hidden. So why does she feel entirely exposed? You and I must recognize that men like Adrian Castellano do not just glance at the world, they dissect it. We often think our masks are impenetrable, but to someone who lives in the shadows, hidden pain is the loudest thing in the room. Adrian Castellano is a man who can identify a lie from a mile away. He wields fear as a currency, and the moment he looked at Lena, he tasted the stark terror radiating from her. Despite her carefully constructed mask, she is pretty, his enforcer, Marco chuckles. A man built for shattering bones rather than reading a room. "Focus on your food," Adrian commands, his tone freezing the table instantly. As his lieutenant Dante watches the exchange, Adrian's attention remains violently tethered to Lena. He observes her smooth, practiced movements, yet he catches the agonizing stiffness in her shoulders. It is the distinct, fragile posture of a body nursing fresh trauma. This is chilling proof that we never truly know the brutal wars people are fighting behind closed doors. We have all encountered that particular illusion, haven't we? The heavy, unnatural foundation blended with the desperate precision of someone merely trying to survive the day. Adrian recognizes it instantly. Within his violent empire, brutality is the primary language, and he has witnessed that bruised mask 1,000 times. Yet, observing it on her triggers a profound, unsettling disruption in his hardened psyche. No, nothing interesting. He lies to Dante, ignoring his meal, His focus is entirely locked onto Lena across the diner. She is actively attempting to shrink into invisibility, but he absorbs every detail. He notes her trembling hands, the hesitant steps, the heartbreaking caution of a woman, and terrified of breathing too deeply against a cracked rib. He catches the exact fraction of a second when she realizes she is being observed. Pure, unadulterated panic shatters her expression before she violently yanks that hollow smile back into place. "Everything okay?" she asks, her voice devoid of life. "Fine," Adrian replies. "The check, please." She escapes the table instantly. While Marco prattles on about supply routes, Adrian's mind is anchored to the terror in her eyes and the violence concealed beneath her cheap makeup. He commands himself to look away, knowing you do not build a criminal empire by inheriting a stranger's tragedy. It is a cynical but effective life lesson. Sometimes, turning a blind eye is the safest survival tactic. He drops a thick stack of bills and leaves, but halfway to the street, he stops dead. Standing in the doorway, he watches her endure the harsh glare of the diner, her exhausted eyes darting toward the exits like a cornered animal. "Get me her name," Adrian commands, his tone leaving no room for debate. Full name, address, everything. Dante barely blinks before nodding. As Adrian steps into the biting air, he lacks a cohesive plan. He only knows that abandoning this woman to her shadow is no longer a choice. Back inside, the remainder of Lena's shift dissolves into a punishing blur. Clearing his table, she discovers $200 resting on a $70 bill. She assumes it is merely an arrogant display of wealth. But friends, true intervention rarely arrives gently. That stack of cash is not just a heavy tip. It is the opening move of a bloody vendetta. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The loud customers were just background noise, but the quiet stranger in the corner felt like a sudden shift in gravity. Lena shoved her crumpled tip money deep into her apron, completely dodging his heavy gaze. He looked at her as if he could read the violent secrets she spent every waking second trying to bury. By the time her shift ended, the bruises across her ribs burned like a branding iron. Her painkillers were completely gone. She ducked into the filthy bathroom, refusing to even glance at the mirror. Riding the midnight bus home, she pressed her pounding head against the icy window. The saddest truth about survival is that when you are fighting just to breathe, simply dreaming of a boring, normal life feels like an impossible luxury. Lena watched the city streets fade away, craving the absolute privilege of ordinary misery. A bad date or a rude boss would be a vacation compared to mapping out exit strategies in your own living room. Her decaying apartment building loomed in the dark like a concrete cage. Every single step up that narrow stairwell was a fresh war against her fractured ribs. The hallway reeked of stale smoke and silent desperation. But the exact second her key slid into the lock, the blood in her veins turned to ice. Eric was waiting inside. She could feel the heavy, suffocating pressure of his anger before the door even swung open. Sometimes the deepest scars we carry are invisible, teaching us that true terror does not always roar. Often, it just sits quietly in the dark, waiting for you to come home. "You are late." The words drifted out of the dark living room, cold and clinical. Eric was not screaming yet, just setting the stage. Lena whispered an excuse about the bus, placing her bag down carefully. When he offered a low grunt, she let out a trapped breath. Neutrality was the best she could hope for. She moved to the kitchen to cook, swallowing the sharp agony radiating from her side. It is a terrifying reality of the human mind how quickly we adapt to pure suffering. Then the air suddenly turned heavy. "Smells good," he muttered, stepping entirely too close. His thick hand clamped down hard on her injured shoulder. The hardest lesson we learn about toxic control is that it is rarely a loud explosion. Most of the time, it is just a silent, crushing grip in the shadows. His hand was not breaking her bones yet, but the quiet promise of violence thrummed right beneath his skin. "You are good at this," he whispered softly. Lena kept her eyes locked on the boiling water, muttering a quiet thanks. Then came the inevitable pivot. He apologized for the night before, using that manufactured softness he always relied on to secure a cheap pardon. He swore he never meant for things to get out of hand. The sheer audacity made her want to shatter every dish in the room. Flinging a woman against a sink is never just a slip-up. Not ever. But survival demands complete submission to the script. She just said it was fine. The most painful reality of living with a monster is learning that fighting for your truth is a luxury that will only get you killed. Eric tightened his fingers just enough to broadcast a chilling reminder. He could snap her bones the second he wanted to. "I love you. You know that?" he asked, his tone thick with artificial warmth. Lena murmured her agreement, playing her part to keep the peace. She listened to his boots retreat, replaced by the blare of the television. Frozen at the stove, she mindlessly stirred the food. The tragedy of abuse is not just the fear, but the creeping apathy that convinces you to stop fighting entirely. But this is exactly where their isolated worlds violently collide. High above her rotting ceiling, a completely different predator was looking down. Adrian Castellano stood by his penthouse glass, silently watching the broken city bleed out into the neon night. At 8 sharp, a man who traded in shadows stepped into the room. Dante dropped a thick dossier onto the polished wood. "Her name is Lena Torres," the enforcer recited. "She is 26, bleeds herself dry at a diner, and barely scrapes by." Adrian slowly peeled the folder open. A pale photograph stared up at him, revealing a woman who had not yet been hollowed out by despair. "Married?" Adrian asked, his voice entirely void of warmth. Dante nodded. 2 agonizing years bound to a parasite named Eric Hale. The man had a long trail of public drunkenness and quiet violence. No prison time, Dante admitted, but the police knew their address by heart. The bitter lesson here is that the law is often just a paper shield, utterly useless against the monsters who share your own home. 5 emergency calls, 0 consequences. Adrian stared at the paper, absorbing the failure. It is a tragic reality, because the math of trauma is always rigged. Her savings barely cleared $300. The pages held medical charts documenting fractured ribs, the undeniable signature of a heavy fist. Dante questioned why a powerful boss was anchored to a random waitress. Adrian snapped the folder closed, demanding full surveillance on her building. Dante warned him that stepping over this line was dangerous. Adrian knew he should walk away. He carried enough sins already. But the vital lesson we learn is that once you recognize the silent scream of a broken spirit, choosing to look the other way becomes the ultimate act of cowardice. Her ghost of a smile had already trapped him. "I want eyes on that building every single second," Adrian ordered. "I need to know exactly where that parasite spends his time." "And the wife?" Dante pressed. Adrian did not hesitate, especially her. Dante slowly nodded, openly asking if the boss was preparing to make a massive mistake. Adrian held his stare. "Probably, actually definitely," he confessed softly. As the enforcer left, Adrian turned back to the sprawling expanse of the city. There were millions of glowing windows out there, hiding countless private wars. He knew the golden rule of the underworld. You cannot play savior to every shattered soul. Intervening in another person's chaos usually ensures you get covered in their blood. The harshest truth of this life is learning that stepping up to save someone else almost always means damning yourself in the process. Yet, some catastrophic choices are beautifully worth the ash they leave behind. Adrian poured 2 fingers of scotch, letting the burn ground him. His thoughts stayed locked on the purple shadows painted across a stranger's ribs. He had constructed his syndicate on freezing logic. In his profession, mercy was a fast pass to a shallow grave. But here is the profound reality we must all eventually confront. Our defining moments are never calculated by reason. They are forged in the quiet dark, driven entirely by what our conscience refuses to ignore. 72 hours later, Lena was rushing between tables when that phantom pressure dropped onto her spine again. The hairs on her arms spiked. She spun around, bracing for an impact, only to find a crowded diner full of perfectly oblivious, laughing strangers. The unseen watcher was back. Lena desperately tried to scrub the paranoia from her mind, but the sensation clung to her like a wet coat. Invisible crosshairs were tracking her every move. She tried to blame the trauma. When you share a bed with a human landmine, sleeping in your shoes just in case you need to run, your brain learns to hallucinate threats. But beneath the panic, a tiny part of her wondered if someone was actually looking out for her. It is a devastating measurement of human despair when the idea of a stalker feels more like a rescue mission than a threat. By dawn, glossy surveillance photos hit Adrian's massive desk. The images documented a pathetic cycle of decay. The very first shot captured Eric stumbling out the door at 9. 2 hours later, the parasite was already passed out in the corner of a rotting downtown tavern. The stack of photos revealed Eric surrounded by other bottom feeders. By late afternoon, he was staggering back to his cage, fully primed for violence. But the evening shots made the muscles in Adrian's jaw physically lock. He watched Lena step into the cold, a fresh layer of concealer failing to hide her damage. He saw her return at midnight, carrying the weight of the sky. The apartment window illuminated, and 20 agonizing minutes later, it went completely black. The camera could not document the horrors in that darkness, but Adrian's mind painted the brutal reality. Dante muttered about Eric's routine, questioning how an unemployed addict afforded his poison. Her tips, Adrian answered, his voice dropping below freezing. The cruelest irony of abuse is that the victim is literally forced to finance the very weapons used to destroy their soul. He bleeds her dry, Adrian whispered, his fingers dragging across the glossy paper. There she was at a grocery store, counting loose change. There she was freezing at a bus stop. In every snapshot, her eyes darted backward, forever anticipating the monster in her shadow. Dante casually offered to go. Have a little conversation with the husband. You and I both understand the grim translation of underworld diplomacy. It always concludes with shattered teeth. Not yet, Adrian instructed. When asked for his strategy, Adrian offered silence. He was disgusted by the horrific machinery of domestic terror, a system that grinds people into dust while society looks away. I am working on it, he murmured. The ultimate truth of wielding absolute power is that once a permanent, violent solution locks into your mind, the inevitable trigger is already pulled. Let us unpack Adrian's strategy together. He built his underground empire by finding a weakness and erasing it. The game plan is identical here, but the delicate trick is saving this woman without morphing into the exact monster she fears. She cannot trade a domestic cage for a Mafia prison. Adrian quietly orders his enforcer, Dante, to track the parasites her husband drinks with. Dante asks if the girl realizes as they are watching. Adrian murmurs that she will figure it out soon enough. He locks his files away and stares at the city below. The people on the street remain oblivious that men in high towers are making silent moves to rewrite their destinies. It just goes to show the most profound changes in our lives often happen when we are looking the exact opposite way. Miles away, Adrian studies the skyline, his mind anchored to Lena. He knows she is trapped, covering up fresh bruises and rehearsing hollow stories to protect the man destroying her spirit. For a boss, the question is never if he can step in. The mystery is whether she will allow herself to be saved. We all need a lifeline sometimes, but reaching out to catch it is the hardest part. The next morning, Lena is filling salt shakers when Maria slides into the booth. Maria asks if they are going to keep pretending this is normal. Lena whispers that everything is fine, but Maria refuses to ignore the heavy makeup and the constant flinching. Lena just stares at the worn table. The simple lesson here is that denial might shield your pride, but it will never heal your wounds. Staring at the salt is easier than making eye contact. That genuine concern is a warmth Lena cannot handle. She mumbles that her situation is complicated, but Maria pushes back, reminding her that real friends do not just watch you get destroyed. How can Lena articulate that walking out is a death sentence? She already tried to escape once. Her husband hunted her down, and the brutal retaliation kept her locked inside for a week. She learned that running only makes the monster twice as vicious, so Lena lies, claiming she has it under control. Maria stays quiet for a moment, then reaches across the table and grips her hand tightly. It is a harsh reality, but sometimes a quiet act of unwavering support is the exact anchor keeping a person from drowning in their own terror. You and I have probably both known someone trying to force a smile through a living nightmare. Maria leans closer and drops a massive bombshell. She tells Lena that she used to have a sister, past tense. She explains how her sister swore she had her toxic romance under control, right up until the police found her body 3 years ago. Hearing this, Lena feels something fragile snap inside her chest. Maria squeezes her hands, warning her that violent men never magically heal. They only turn up the heat. Lena finally exhales, confessing she has no idea what it is. The rock-bottom admission of a woman who realizes the walls are crushing her. Recognizing you are in real danger is terrifying, but facing that ugly truth is always the essential first step towards survival. Maria begs her to pack a bag, walk out, and never look back. Lena instantly drops her defensive excuses, terrified that her husband will hunt her down again. Maria insists there are safe houses designed to pull victims out of the darkest situations. But Lena sharply pulls her hands away and returns to the salt shakers. That mindless routine is the only thing she can control while her universe spins off its axis. She whispers a hollow lie about needing time to think it over. Then the afternoon rush hits them like a freight train. Lena pushes through the chaos, her bruised ribs feeling like jagged glass with every breath. Keeping busy is a classic trauma response. Sometimes we bury ourselves in the daily grind just to avoid facing the reality that our time is rapidly running out. The shift happens while wiping down a corner booth. She gets that intense prickling sensation of heavy eyes locked onto her. Lena turns around and locks gazes with a stranger at table 14. He sits perfectly still, zeroed in on her like a predator. He gives a slow, deliberate nod as if they share an unspoken secret. Her pulse hammers against her bruised ribs. She forces herself to stack plates, hands shaking so violently she almost drops them. By the time her shift ends, she realizes three drift men have been tracking her every move. Her nerves are fried. She changes clothes fast, avoids her reflection, and rushes out the back door. Always pay attention to your instincts. When your gut tells you the shadows around you suddenly have teeth, it is time to start moving. She makes it half a block before hearing the sound. Footsteps, steady, matching her panicked pace. Glancing back, her worst nightmare materializes. One of the watchers from the diner. Pure panic floods her system. Lena bolts, gasping for air as the pain in her chest drags her down, but she is outmatched. A hand clamps onto her wrist, stopping her dead. She screams and swings wildly, but the man restrains her with a calm grip. He tells her to relax, swearing he will not. He introduces himself as Dande, adding that his boss, Adrian Castellano, requests a word. Lena stands there, drowning in adrenaline. It is wild how fast life flips. 1 second you are sprinting for survival, and the next, a syndicate enforcer wants a chat. Every crisis proves that control is an illusion. Stick with me here, because this is where the narrative flips. Lena gasps for air, demanding to know who he means. Dante maintains his cool and reminds her of the wealthy gentleman she served last week. He states a car is waiting to discuss her situation. Lena instantly throws her mask back on, denying she has any situation at all. But Dante hits her with a look of pity. He starts dropping cold facts, the hidden bruises, the husband drinking away her tips, the harsh reality that she is one bad night away from a body bag. His heavy words hit far harder than a punch. How did this random syndicate enforcer decode her secret life? It proves a powerful lesson. No matter how many fake walls you build to hide your daily misery, the raw truth always finds a way to bleed through the cracks. Dante offers a gentle nod, swearing his boss is tossing her a lifeline. Lena snaps back, demanding to know why a powerful man would care about a nobody. Before Dante answers, a beast of a black sedan rolls out of the alley. The door pops open, and Adrian Castellano steps onto the pavement. He moves like a predator who owns the streets, wearing a suit worth more than her life. But here is the fascinating detail. His dark eyes hold a heavy, ancient sorrow. He says her name with gravity and apologizes for the ambush. When she accuses him of stalking her, he does not even attempt to spin the narrative. He simply looks her dead in the eye and says, yes. Total ownership, honesty, is wild. A single drop of unfiltered truth can shatter defensive walls that took agonizing years to build. Lena stands shivering in the cold and flat out asks him why he is doing this. Adrian steps closer, and she does not even flinch. He tells her straight up that it is because she needed someone to finally notice her pain. He starts peeling back the dark layers of her life like a surgeon. He knows about the explosive rages, the fake hospital stories, and the exhaustion of funding her own torture. He destroys her denial until she is totally exposed. So she asks the ultimate question. What does he want in return? His quiet answer drops her. Nothing. He just wants to help. We know perfectly well that this gritty world almost never gives you something for free. But sometimes, when you are at your lowest point, a random miracle shows up dressed in a tailored Mafia suit. Adrian promises her absolute protection that will make her husband realize that even looking in her direction means his funeral. Lena whispers, still in shock, asking why he cares so deeply. A heavy shadow drops over Adrian's eyes, and he unloads a dark backstory. He confesses that his mother stays quid with his violent father for 15 brutal years. The same man who tucked him into bed turned into a monster by midnight. When his mother finally found the courage to run, his father took her out in a parking lot. Adrian was only 12, watching as his own flesh and blood destroyed the woman he loved. It is completely tragic, but it teaches a sobering lesson. Sometimes the very people society claims are supposed to protect us end up being the exact monsters we need saving from. Tears well up in Lena's eyes as she breathes out an apology. Adrian holds her gaze, a man driven by the ghosts of his past. He spent his childhood praying for a heavy hitter to show up and save his mother. Now that he holds that power, he refuses to abandon another girl trapped in the dark. He tells her the choice is hers. She can walk back to her apartment and wait for the terrible ending, or step into his ride and vanish. His crew will handle the fallout. Her husband will learn that she is permanently off limits. She could finally breathe again without fear. Let us reflect on this choice. This boss is offering her a brand new tomorrow. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes real survival means dropping your heavy shield and letting someone else fight the war for you. Let us step into this pivotal scene together. You and I, Adrian, is extending the ultimate lifeline, offering unlimited funds, elite attorneys, and an impenetrable wall of security. Lena stares at him, completely bewildered. Why would an underworld boss orchestrate this for a total stranger? He offers a hollow, haunted smile, replying that he did it simply because he has the power to. The heavy ghosts of his past linger in his voice, seeking redemption for a mother who never got her own escape. Lena closes her eyes, the suffocating memory of her apartment and Eric's coiled fists flashing through her mind. The fundamental truth here is that true survival often means accepting the hand reaching into your darkness. She opens her eyes, whispers a plea for help, and Adrian simply nods, instructing her to pack only what truly matters. Pure terror still claws at her throat as she imagines Eric catching them in the act. Yet Adrian remains smooth as ice, checking his phone and casually noting that her abuser is anchored at a local bar for 2 hours. Knowing a monster's exact schedule should be chilling, but for Lena, it acts as a much-needed safety blanket. For the first time, a formidable presence is standing guard in her corner. Dante holds the car door, and she takes a shivering breath before stepping into the unknown. Back in her apartment, the walls seem to aggressively close in, every punched hole in the drywall staring back like a bruised eye. The profound reality is simple. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic soil that poisoned you. Dante waits by the door like a silent fortress while she hastily throws the remnants of her shattered life into a single faded bag. She abandons most of her belongings, knowing Adrian promised to replace the meaningless material things. Instead, she gathers only her emotional anchors, her late grandmother's sweater, and a photo album from the days before Eric dismantled her spirit. Catching Herb's reflection in the bathroom mirror, she freezes. The makeup is wearing thin, revealing the raw, ugly edges of a fresh bruise and a split lip. Yet, for the first time in 2 agonizing years, she does not reach for the concealer. She allows the physical damage to breathe. It is a stark reminder that masking your wounds never truly cures the infection beneath. Dante's low voice echoes from the hallway, issuing a strict 10-minute warning. Lena takes one final look at the lumpy couch where she wept herself to sleep every night, finally walking away from the tragic figure she used to be. Stick with me here, because this is where the tension truly spikes. Just 3 blocks away from the apartment, the quiet car ride is shattered by her phone vibrating. Eric's name flashes across the screen like a toxic digital leash. Her thumb hovers over the answer button, trembling out of pure, conditioned habit. But Dante's voice drops into a steady, grounding rumble, reminding her that she owes us that month's absolutely nothing The phone screams, hits voicemail, and violently rings again. With a heavy sigh, Lena powers the device down completely. The hard truth is that severing ties with toxic people is often the only path to reclaiming your sanity. They arrive at a pristine safe house in a quiet neighborhood. Dont escorts her to a third-floor apartment, points out a fully stocked fridge, orders her to keep the phone dead, and quietly vanishes. Everything in this pristine space functions perfectly, completely free from the duct tape and misery of her past. The bathroom door even features a heavy inside lock, a detail that feels like a fortress. She sinks into the couch, bracing herself for the usual crushing panic or the lingering guilt insisting she made a mistake. But the storm never arrives. There is only absolute relief. An hour later, Adrian steps inside and finds her glued to the spot, processing the surreal reality of her freedom. He sits down, shedding the intimidating aura of a boss, and softly asks how she is holding up. Staring at her trembling hands, she admits to a bone-deep exhaustion. He notes she has been running on pure terror for 2 years. Life teaches us that you never realize how crushing a burden is until you finally set it down. He assures her tonight is solely for rest. Adrian lays out the ultimate blueprint for her survival, promising swift divorce papers, protective orders, and secure bank accounts. His lethal sharks will handle every detail, yet Lena remains consumed by anxiety, quietly asking what happens to Eric. In an instant, Adrian's expression hardens into stone. He calmly murmurs that Eric is being managed, and that laying another finger on her would be his final mistake. Hearing this boss into body delivered, such a dark threat should be terrifying, but Lena only feels profound gratitude. It reveals a stark truth. Sometimes, the only force that stops a relentless bully is a far more dangerous protector standing in the gap. She whispers a tentative thank you, but he brushes it away. Still guarded, she finally asks why he is fighting so hard for a stranger. Adrian goes dead silent, his eyes suddenly haunted. You and I are going to look at this together, because the emotional pivot here is profound. Adrian's eyes carry 2 decades of heavy baggage as he unveils his darkest truth. He confesses that at 12 years old, he hid in a closet, entirely powerless, listening to his father end his mother's life. Building a sprawling underworld empire means absolutely nothing to him if he cannot save someone from that exact same horror. This raw honesty completely floors Lena. She expected a calculating boss, not a man still bleeding from childhood wounds. It illuminates how our deepest, most agonizing traumas frequently define our greatest life missions. Adrian rejects her sympathetic apologies, making it clear he merely wants to be the impenetrable shield his mother never received. He stands, notes that Dante is guarding the hall, and promises that tomorrow they go to war. Right as he reaches the door, Lena swears with a trembling voice that she will repay every single cent once this nightmare concludes. But Adrian's sharp jaw softens. He tells her the only payment he cares about is her staying alive. Everything else is meaningless static. Left alone, Lena wanders through the quiet apartment, running her hands over clean bedsheets and admiring the sturdy lock on the door. It is fascinating how the simple comforts we take for granted manifest as absolute miracles to someone stripped of everything. Stepping into a scalding shower, the emotional dam finally breaks. 2 brutal years of operating in pure survival mode wash down the drain. Dressed in fresh clothes, she crawls into bed without that familiar, sickening pit of dread. Ultimately, simply giving yourself the permission to rest is sometimes the most profound victory. When she wakes, her mind remains blissfully blank for a split second before the surreal memories come flooding back. The desperate escape, the tense car ride, and the fragile promise of a new beginning. She holds her breath, actively listening to the space around her. There is absolutely nothing. No heavy boots stomping across the floorboards, no terrifying clink of glass bottles, and zero violent outbursts. Her phone remains powered down as she already knows the toxic barrage waiting. Eric has likely called 100 times, oscillating between weeping apologies and vicious threats. The painful lesson is that manipulative abusers weaponize guilt to maintain their invisible prisons. But today breaks that cycle. She is not cowering in a sketchy bus terminal. Walking to the closet, she discovers brand new clothes that feel like an absolute sanctuary. Adrian orchestrated every detail with frightening precision. A fresh toothbrush waits by the sink, and the kitchen is stocked with artisan bread and dark coffee. Lena prepares a quiet breakfast, realizing she cannot remember the last time her stomach was not twisted into nervous knots. True healing is found when you can finally experience peace within the most mundane daily routines. She is rinsing her plate when 3 sharp knocks rattle the door. It is Dante, and he is brought back up. Beside him stands a woman in a razor-sharp tailored suit, her eyes cold and deeply professional. This is Catherine Ambrose, is the predatory legal shark Adrian dispatched for the impending war. She extends a steady hand and calmly asks if Lena is ready to officially file for divorce. That word hangs heavily in the air, feeling exactly like a lit match dropping onto soaked gasoline. We are about to uncover the anatomy of what went down next. Lena takes a fractured breath and forces the word out, confirming she is ready. Catherine drops a dense stack of legal documents onto the table, digging into the miserable arithmetic of Lena's marriage to paralyze her husband with an emergency order. Lena is terrified, asking how long the legal shield will take. Catherine explains the protective order is instantaneous. If he crosses the line, he goes straight to a concrete cell. But Lena knows the psychology of her abuser. Eric would gladly scorch the earth before accepting defeat. She nervously asks what happens when he inevitably ignores the court order. The vital lesson here is the necessity of surrounding yourself with people who will fight your battles. Catherine does not even twitch. She stares back and calmly promises to bring the fire directly to his front door. Let us unpack this dynamic together. Catherine delivers a cold dose of reality, fundamentally shifting the power balance. She explains that having a figure like Adrian Castellano in her corner is the ultimate disruption to the control of her abuser. An order from a judge might mean nothing to Eric, but the shadow of a criminal syndicate speaks a language of absolute dominance. Strangely, this terrifying truth brings Lena a profound sense of peace. For 2 grueling hours, they dissect the anatomy of her suffering. Catherine remains completely composed, asking only for the documentation of that trauma. Those hospital records are no longer just memories of victimhood. They are about to be forged into weapons. The lesson here is enduring. The very wounds inflicted to keep someone subjugated often become the undeniable evidence that finally sets them free. Catherine writes with the precision of an archivist documenting a tragedy. When asked for police reports, Lena can only shake her head, trapped by the shame of having once disguised her injuries as mere accidents. Operating without judgment, Catherine pivots smoothly, asking for witnesses. Lena thinks of Maria from the Italian restaurant, the lone soul who offered a sliver of warmth. But the suffocating reality quickly sets in. The neighbors undoubtedly heard the shattering glass and the screams, Yet they chose the comfortable silence of inaction. Dozens of passive spectators simply watched her slow destruction. Recognizing the heavy guilt settling over Lena, Catherine gently closes her folder. It reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth about human nature. You can never expect the crowd to be your savior, because most people will lock their doors when the storm actually arrives. The attorney pierces through that lingering guilt with surgical precision. She reminds Lena that Eric cremated their vows the first time he chose violence. This paperwork is merely an autopsy for a marriage that died long ago. Catherine confirms the filing happens today. By dawn, an invisible legal fortress will stand between Lena and her tormentor. The instructions for survival are absolute. Remain indoors, cut all communication, and refuse to look back. Just like that, the captive transforms into a phantom. Yet, the human mind is fragile. In a moment of sheer recklessness, Lena grasps her dead phone as if it were an unpinned grenade, consumed by a morbid curiosity to witness his unraveling. The lesson is timeless. Stepping away from the poison is only the physical escape. Killing the psychological addiction to looking back is the true battle. A war wages within her mind, but the compulsion wins. The screen instantly erupts into a digital manifesto of obsession, 47 missed calls and 32 frantic messages. Recognizing the venom before it can infect her peace, she kills the power. She spends the afternoon drifting through the Mafia safe house, marveling at the surreal luxury of her refuge. A warm shower and a soft bed feel like stolen privileges after 2 years in a psychological prison, yet her thoughts remain anchored to the glaring anomaly of Adrian Castellano, a king of the underworld who randomly deployed his resources to rescue a stranger. Men wielding that level of terrifying influence do not dispense miracles without a motive. It brings us to a fundamental law of survival. Whenever an escape route appears completely flawless, you must immediately begin searching for the invisible toll it will demand. Picture this. You and I are sitting in that heavy, suffocating silence of a strange room where the brain shifts into absolute paranoia. Lena is agonizing over the master plan of Adrian. He has not demanded a single concession, and this absence of a transaction is far more alarming than the cruelty of a former husband. The structure of her abuse was horrific, but it had a legible pattern. You endure the pain to earn survival. This syndicate leader operates on an entirely foreign axis. Around 6, Dante arrives with food, casually mentioning that the Don intends to visit her later. The simple statement causes a glacial panic to cascade through her veins. It illuminates a deeply unsettling reality. Sometimes, the sudden unearned benevolence of an untouchable stranger feels vastly more terrifying than the predictable brutality of the devil you already know. Before Dante can leave, Lena anchors him to the spot. She demands to know his tenure with the boss, searching for a baseline of trust. 8 years, he replies. She presses further, desperate to uncover if Adrian secretly operates a sanctuary for the broken. Dante pauses, delivering a chilling assessment of his employer. Adrian adheres to an unorthodox moral compass. He is capable of total salvation or absolute destruction, but his given word is an unbreakable contract. He promises her safety and vanishes. Left in the quiet, Lena stares at her meal, wrestling with the glaring warnings in her periphery. What kind of vast, shadowy empire is mobilized merely to shield one woman from an abuser? It encapsulates a profound dilemma. We spend so much of our frantic existence fleeing from the wolves that we completely fail to question why a tiger just offered us a place in his den. At exactly 8, the arrival of Adrian rewrites the pressure of the room. He traded his corporate armor for dark jeans and a black shirt, an aesthetic that paradoxically amplifies his lethal aura. Taking a seat, he maintains a calculated distance. The legal machinery of the divorce is turning. But when the topic shifts to Eric, the voice of the mob boss plummets to absolute zero. He reveals a surveillance network that borders on the omniscient. Every phone call, every drunken stumble her former husband makes is monitored. Should Eric even exhale in her direction, Adrian will know. For a normal civilian, this predatory tracking would be deeply disturbing. For Lena, it washes over her like a baptism of security. The psychological takeaway is stark. When you have spent years drowning in the unpredictable waves of chaos, a measure of dark control feels exactly like a lifesaver. The tension fractures, and Lena snaps. She demands to understand the architecture of a man who manipulates the underworld with the ease of a puppet master. Adrian becomes perfectly still, the gears of calculation visible before he removes his diplomatic mask. He openly confesses to ruling a sprawling empire, a hybrid of legitimate enterprises and operations buried deep in the dirt. When Lena labels him a criminal, he absorbs the word without a flinch. He prefers the term businessman, one who simply bypasses inconvenient legislation. He asks if proximity to his darkness will send her fleeing. Instead of fear, Lena remembers the apathetic police officers who repeatedly left her broken. It forces us to confront a bitter reality. High morals and playing by the rules mean absolutely nothing when the designated good guys continuously leave you bleeding on the floor. Weighing the failure of the institutions meant to protect her, Lena meets his gaze. She states that his status outside the law is completely irrelevant. A fleeting smile alters the stoic expression of the crime lord. He admits his surprise that she bypassed the expected moral condemnation, but Lena is exhausted by the theater of the high ground. She followed every legal avenue only to find the law shielding her abuser. She delivers a devastating truth. This Shadow King provided more genuine sanctuary in 2 days than the forces of justice managed in 2 years. Adrian remains silent, studying the depths of her resilience. It reveals an uncomfortable truth about survival. The morally righteous path and the legally correct avenue are rarely the same. Sometimes, your only ticket to salvation arrives wearing the mask of an absolute villain. The atmosphere settles into silence. Stick with me, because this is where the dynamic truly shifts. Lena asks the essential question: what exactly is the strategic objective? Adrian answers with the detachment of a tactician. They will file the documents, deploy the order, and observe the fallout. Lena then voices her deepest fear, asking what happens if Eric descends into violent madness. Adrian does not blink. He coldly promises their retaliation will simply escalate. Before he exits, Lena asks the question haunting her logic. In a city of broken lives, why did he elect to save hers? The untouchable crime lord physically freezes. For a fragile moment, the mastermind looks entirely unmoored, unable to intellectualize his own mercy. It highlights a profound reality. We constantly try to force logic onto the universe, but the most massive connections are born from pure, irrational instinct. The formidable armor of the boss finally cracks. He confesses to observing her at the restaurant, noting the paralyzing terror concealed behind her smile. In that moment, something within his hardened psychology fractured. The option of walking away ceased to exist. Watching his vehicle dissolve into the shadows, Lena confronts the reality that her fate is tethered to a sovereign of the underworld. Paradoxically, the realization brings a deep sense of security. However, the dawn shatters that peace. Catherine, delivers the definitive update. The judge authorized the documents, and the police officially served Eric. Immediately, a visceral dread twists her stomach into a knot. The storm has officially arrived. Let us absorb an essential truth. The precise second an abuser comprehends the evaporation of their control is the exact moment their capacity for violence reaches its terrifying zenith. Let us analyze this juncture. The police issued Eric a clear ultimatum. Any violation results in incarceration. But when the phone goes silent, a horrifying realization crystallizes. Men forged in domestic tyranny do not acquiesce to legal mandates. A glacial dread locks her joints. You and I have likely witnessed this dynamic, that suffocating shift in the atmosphere when a storm upgrades its severity. Eric was never going to passively sign away his possession. Within the corrupted architecture of his mind, Lena is not a partner, she is property. The morning stretches into a psychological torture chamber. She attempts to distract herself, but his shadow occupies her consciousness. By midday, Dante knocks with grave updates. It illuminates a brutal reality. Escaping the physical grip of a toxic environment is rarely the conclusion. It merely serves as the brutal prologue to a vastly more dangerous war. Dante drops a heavy bag on the table, his expression completely hollow. He delivers the crushing news that Eric is actively hunting her, squeezing the street-level ghosts for any trace. Lena feels her throat turn to dust. Nobody is talking, naturally, because helping Eric is a guaranteed ticket to the morgue. Dante calls her ex-predictable, but panic rejects logic. Then, the apartment landline violently shatters the silence. Lena stares at the receiver, barely breathing. Nobody has this number. On the fourth ring, she answers. It is Eric, slurring and unhinged, demanding answers about the legal papers. She begs to know how he found her, but he just barks an order to come home. The reality is chilling. The absolute scariest monsters in this world are never hiding under the bed. They are the ones who have spent years memorizing the exact architecture of your deepest vulnerabilities. Notice how the abuser operates. Eric launches into a fabricated apology tour, swearing they can fix everything. But Lena holds her ground, declaring it permanently over. His response is a chilling, hollow laugh that strips away the mask. He hisses that she does not get to make the rules, his voice hitting that dangerous pitch that always precedes violence. He actually claims she is his property. Dante slips quietly into the room and gestures for her to end the call. Finding a spark of defiance, Lena commands Eric to stay away and slams the receiver down. When the machine rings again, Dante casually steps forward and rips the entire cord straight out of the drywall. He checks his screen. They traced his burner. True courage is never the absence of fear. It is possessing the sheer willpower to hang up the phone while the devil is still actively trying to brainwash you. The trace points directly to Eric's usual territory. Dante instantly shifts into a cold, mechanical state of pure business. He orders her to pack right now. They are relocating her to Adrian Castellano's personal estate, a fortified compound beyond the city limits. Lena is exhausted from running and wants to fight back, but Eric's unhinged threats still echo in her mind. Her hands tremble as she shoves her clothes into a bag. Meanwhile, Dante barks sharp commands into his device. Minutes later, they are speeding north, leaving the gritty city behind for a world of heavy iron gates and elite security forces. We have to acknowledge a bitter reality here. When you are forced to flee a relentless predator, you rarely find true freedom. Sometimes, basic SAR survival simply means trading your current nightmare for a beautiful cage with much heavier locks. The security perimeter at this estate is intimidating. It radiates a silent message that the owner possesses the wealth to buy total isolation and the muscle to enforce it. Dante guides her inside, where a warm housekeeper named Rosa waits. Lena ascends a sweeping staircase into a suite that makes her old life look tiny. We are talking imported silk sheets and luxury that borders on aggressive. Overwhelmed, Lena whispers that this is entirely too much. Rosa merely smirks, stating that Castellano never does anything halfway. Left alone, Lena collapses onto the mattress, her mind refusing to power down. There is a deeply unsettling truth about carrying trauma. When you have spent your entire existence bracing for the next violent impact, finally stepping into a genuinely safe space actually feels exactly like walking into a carefully baited trap. Let us examine this psychological whiplash. Just 3 days ago, Lena was peeling herself off a freezing bathroom floor. Now, she sits inside a fortified stronghold, guarded by a syndicate leader to escape a husband who wants her dead. Adrian fills the doorway as she unpacks. His collar is loose, but his eyes are sharp as glass. He apologizes for the phone line, promising this house is a vault. Lena's voice trembles, warning him that Eric will never stop. Adrian steps forward, his dark energy consuming the oxygen. He casually delivers a chilling promise, declaring they will teach Eric what happens when you touch something that belongs to Adrian Castellano. That extreme level of ownership should be a massive warning sign. But the strange reality of survival is that sometimes you simply have to recruit a much larger monster just to keep the everyday wolves at bay. The concept of possession takes a very different shape here. Unlike the suffocating control Eric demanded, Adrian's possessiveness projects the safety of a titanium shield. When Lena points out she does not actually belong to him, Adrian nods. He explains that in his violent world, keeping someone under his wing means ownership to any rival foolish enough to test him. She asks what he plans to do to her husband. Adrian lets a heavy silence fall. He promises to show Eric how violently narrow his options truly are. He can sign the papers and vanish, or keep pushing and meet the demons in the dark. Lena realizes this man is prepared to destroy her abuser. The shocking part, she feels zero disgust, only profound relief. We all eventually learn a vital truth. A fist raised to lock you in a cage is fundamentally different from a sword drawn to protect your peace. Welcome to the midnight hour. You and I are about to step into the shadows of a complex story. Picture Lena, her anxiety spiking as Adrian casually announces the takedown happens tonight. He reads Eric as an unstable variable requiring a preemptive strike. The room shrinks as Lena stares at this dangerous crime boss and literally begs him not to end her abuser's life. Genuine shock registers in Adrian's cold eyes. Lena refuses to absorb that dark karma. She must prove she operates above the villains. Adrian recognizes the crushing weight of her pain, and miraculously, he backs down. He agrees to let Eric breathe, but promises to make him realize his existence depends entirely on Lena's mercy. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes, the absolute greatest demonstration of true strength is simply holding back the darkness when you possess the power to destroy someone. Adrian holds her gaze, asking if she is certain. He warns that once he initiates the sequence, there is zero turning back. He establishes the ultimate law. Her ex receives exactly one warning. If Eric breathes her name with any aggression, that mercy is revoked permanently. Lena nods. Adrian steps into the corridor, dropping quiet, lethal instructions into his phone. When he returns, his expression is carved from granite. He tells her not to offer thanks, noting that gratitude should never be wasted on merely sparing a parasite's life. But beneath that armor of ice, Lena recognizes a massive shift. This ruthless architect of violence just suppressed his killer instincts and purely to give her peace. Moved by this connection, Lena impulsively asks him to stay for dinner. It illustrates a beautiful, universal truth. At our core, we all just desperately seek a safe harbor when the storm is raging outside. Adrian is visibly caught off guard by the invitation. Lena admits she simply wants company, and for a second, the untouchable boss softens into a haunted man. He actually accepts. They sit across from each other at a massive table, yet the room feels intimate. Initially, the space is consumed by silence. For years, silence in Lena's world was a terrifying warning system, the quiet countdown before Eric would explode. But tonight, the quiet feels remarkably like medicine. She breaks the tension by asking about his mother. Adrian lowers his fork, his gaze drifting into the dark corridors of his past. He describes a woman whose profound kindness made her a tragic mismatch for the underworld. She genuinely believed her unconditional love could repair toxic men. Here is a harsh reality check. A pure, radiant heart simply cannot always reconstruct what is fundamentally broken within somebody else. Adrian stares into his wine glass as if the dark liquid holds his personal demons. He quietly admits his mother was catastrophically wrong about love curing violent men. It forms an immediate trauma bond between him and Lena. He recalls his mother's cooking, the one bright memory untouched by his father's brutal legacy. When Lena asks if he thinks of her often, he confesses she is present every single day. He uses her memory as a moral anchor, the boundary preventing him from crossing the line into a monster. He thinks of her sacrifice every time he encounters a victim desperate for a lifeline. This terrifying figure built an empire of intimidation to honor a mother who perished because nobody intervened. Lena assures him she would be proud, yet he remains tortured by his methods. It is a profound tragedy. We often construct our heaviest armor out of the exact same violence that originally broke us. Let us look closely at this dynamic. Lena is actively trying to convince a hardened boss that a massive divide exists between being a monster and acting as an instrument of karma. Adrian merely studies her face, fully aware of how quickly that moral line dissolves in his grim profession. As they finish their meal, Adrian sheds his impenetrable persona, revealing a man who is just as internally fractured. Then, a profound realization hits Lena. For the first time in years, her brain is not frantically calculating escape routes. She is simply existing. She is breathing. Adrian stands to leave, offering an unbreakable promise to handle her toxic ex tomorrow. He looks at her and confirms that she is finally safe. The architecture of healing is wild, isn't it? Sometimes the absolute hardest step in life is simply granting ourselves the permission to drop our heavy shields and finally take a real deep breath. Let us observe the dark city streets together. We know exactly what is unfolding in the shadows. Eric is receiving the harshest wake-up call of his existence, discovering that his toxic dominion over Lena is finally severed. High above, Lena rests within the walls of a syndicate fortress. Yet, one must ask what the true cost of a mobster playing savior really is. She sleeps, unaware of the invisible ledger tallying her debt. At 3 a.m, the illusion of peace fractures. Trauma rewires the mind to reject safety. Downstairs, urgent voices echo, and Dante ascends the staircase, looking pale as ash. It is a harsh truth of the human condition. Sometimes, perceived safety is merely a fleeting mirage before the inevitable cycle of violence begins anew. Lena is gripped by panic, demanding answers before Dante can even form a word. The revelation drops heavily. Her abusive husband is in a hospital bed. Terror washes over her as she asks what violence they unleashed. Dante, jaw tight with stress, states they merely answered Eric with the exact currency he requested. The narcissist is awake, predictably weaponizing his injuries and threatening to drag the ordeal to the press. Downstairs, Adrian observes the fallout with the calm of a king surveying a conquered territory. The physical toll is minimal, broken ribs and a fractured wrist, yet it illuminates a chilling reality about abusive dynamics. Escaping a toxic cycle rarely results in a ceasefire. The invisible war simply changes battlegrounds until one side is ruined. Adrian remains a statue of ice. He explains that the warning was administered exactly as planned. However, Eric was blinded by his beta ego. The man spat at syndicate enforcers, screaming vows to hunt Lena down. The broken bones simply translated his cheap threats into physical consequences. Adrian fixes his gaze on Lena, ensuring she understands he kept his promise to leave the man breathing. In organized crime, a verbal threat is a signed contract. Lena collapses into a chair, trembling at the thought of Eric lying to the authorities. Adrian remains completely unfazed by police involvement. The true horror lies in human obsession. A desperate, toxic individual will gladly sink their own ship if it means drowning you alongside them. A rational person interprets shattered ribs as a signal to retreat, but Lena understands the psychological machinery of her former captor. She whispers a profound truth. Eric is not acting out of courage. He is experiencing a collapse because his authority has been stripped away. When a controller loses their grip, the descent into madness is swift. Lena is certain he will keep hunting. Adrian solidifies into an immovable force, vowing Eric will never touch her again. Yet, a mafia boss cannot serve as a permanent shield. Adrian grows entirely still, the dormant predator rising behind his calm gaze. If the ex refuses to yield, Adrian will simply erase his existence. You and I must recognize this reality. Sometimes, surviving a monster requires untethering a far deadlier beast. The core of her spirit that endured years of torment recognizes a bitter certainty. Negotiation with a malignant force is impossible. Lena confesses her reluctance to see anyone lowered into the earth, yet her days of playing the prey are finished. Adrian steps closer, embodying a paradox of lethal danger and profound sanctuary. He assures her it will not escalate to murder, though the gravel in his tone suggests otherwise. In his worldview, Eric ignited this war the moment he struck her. Any fatal consequence is merely a harvest of Eric's own planting. When Lena mentions the authorities, Adrian dismisses the concept entirely. The law is an abstract idea. He is the physical barrier. It is a sobering lesson. Highly toxic individuals are immune to the concept of a peaceful resolution. Let us examine the pattern here. Abusers molded in Eric's image never gracefully exit the stage. They escalate their violence until a superior force breaks their momentum. Adrian has positioned himself as that immovable wall. Lena studies him, wrestling with cognitive dissonance. How can the gentle man who shared a quiet dessert be the same boss orchestrating violence? By all logic, she should be repulsed. Yet, it translates into a strange comfort. His gentleness and his brutality are merely two distinct instruments used to keep her alive. When Lena confesses her terror, Adrian validates it, noting that fear is the ultimate survival instinct. He takes her hand. It is the first touch exchanged outside the rush of danger, asking for absolutely nothing. True salvation often arrives wearing a frightening mask. Adrian anchors her trembling hand in the dark, offering himself as an eclipse against her monster. The gravity of his underworld pulls at Lena. Surrendering to it would be effortless, yet catastrophically dangerous. Recognizing the precipice, she gently withdraws her fingers. Adrian accepts the boundary without judgment, calmly noting they will wait for her ex to move at dawn. Lena offers quiet gratitude that restraint is lethal instincts, acknowledging that leaving Eric breathing complicates the board. Adrian softly replies that every meaningful endeavor is inherently messy. Left alone in the cavernous bedroom, Lena stares at the ceiling. The true burden of outlasting trauma is not fleeing the inferno. It is sitting in the quiet aftermath, waiting for the embers to stop burning. Lena is stranded in a paradox, existing in a sanctuary that carries the scent of impending violence. As morning filters in, she abandons the pursuit of sleep. Finding Rosa downstairs preparing coffee, Lena confesses the heavy weight of her anxiety. Rosa passes her a warm mug and reveals a poignant truth. Adrian has not anchored himself to another human being this deeply in years. Lena attempts to dismiss the notion, pointing out the brief timeline of their acquaintance. But Rosa simply smiles, sharing the story of her own sister. She was also imprisoned by a violent partner until the syndicate boss intervened. This interaction exposes a profound reality about connection. Shared suffering possesses its own distinct vocabulary, instantly transforming strangers into lifelong allies. Rosa details how her sister wore a map of bruises until Adrian finally noticed. The consequence of his discovery was absolute. The abusive husband simply ceased to exist, leaving her sister to rebuild her life. When Lena asks about the man's final destination, Rosa offers a dismissive shrug. Ignorance is the ultimate safety net here. The silence hangs thick. Adrian is an architect of permanent solutions. Eric only draws breath because Lena acts as a restraint. She asks Rosa if she should slip the leash and let Adrian finish it. Rosa replies with quiet wisdom. We must all carry the weight of our choices, but certain malignancies demand removal. Dante then enters, his posture screaming defeat. True preservation of peace sometimes demands severing a rotting branch so the rest of the tree can survive. Dante shatters the calm with an update. Eric has abandoned his hospital bed, slipping into the city to evade syndicate eyes. The silver fork slips from Lena's fingers as cold dread settles in her stomach. A cornered predator is drafting a counter-offensive. Dante confirms this fear, sliding a phone across the table to reveal Eric's digital warfare. The abuser is broadcasting a fabricated tragedy, weaving a public narrative that his wife was abducted by criminals. Lena pleads to have the posts scrubbed, but Dante declines. Eric is constructing a digital shield. If he falls now, he becomes a public martyr. We must recognize this manipulative strategy. The most lethal tool a toxic individual wields is the ability to invert reality, erasing their own cruelty to crown themselves the tragic victim. You and I understand the desperate violence of a cornered animal, yet Adrian delivers a cold dose of tactical logic. If Eric is allowed to martyr himself, using force to silence him only validates his fiction. The crime boss outlines a psychological checkmate. The strategy is to feed the abuser the exact scenario he craves. A highly controlled confrontation. Dante protests, unwilling to place Lena back into the line of fire. Adrian sees the chessboard clearly. Eric must witness Lena standing unbroken, a visual that incinerates his false narrative. It is a vital lesson in surviving manipulation. Allowing an adversary the illusion of control is often the very mechanism used to spring a flawless trap. Lena listens in absolute silence, her pulse racing against her ribs. The thought of sharing oxygen with her abuser twists Lena's stomach. Yet, the brutal logic of Adrian's plan is undeniable. If her former captor is broadcasting a narrative of her imprisonment, she must dismantle it herself. She volunteers, pushing the words past her lips before the adrenaline fades. Dante objects, but Lena recognizes that Eric's obsession has no natural expiration date. Fixing her eyes on Adrian, she issues a single demand. He must remain in the shadows, watching over her. They select a bustling cafe, transforming a public space into a stage where they control the variables. Sometimes, the only method to strip a monster of its power is to drag it into the unforgiving glare of broad daylight. The goal is to force Eric to reveal his true violent nature to the world. Dante acts as the tactical architect mapping exits, while Adrian commands the room's psychological space. He understands violence, yet prefers the elegance of absolute control. For Lena, the hours drag like heavy iron. She dreads the reunion, terrified of the rage lurking behind Eric's constructed mask. By nightfall, she's a fragile wire trembling in the garden. Adrian finds her, asking if the weight of tomorrow is too much. She admits her doubts, yet knows she must face the monster on her own terms. When she asks if Eric will try to hurt her, Adrian offers no soft lies. Here is a tragic but vital life lesson for us to remember. Deeply fractured people will always crave the sick thrill of breaking someone else, just to feel a fleeting illusion of power. Adrian explains that Eric relies on a coward's logic. A violent public spectacle would ruin his crafted image. Lena voices her ultimate fear. What if this of King the Underworld is wrong? Adrian does not blink. He makes an unyielding vow, swearing Eric will not lay a finger on her. Eric had methodically destroyed her capacity to trust. Yet looking into Adrian's eyes, Lena believes him. She trusts this orchestrator of shadows as her shield. When she admits her terror, Adrian replies that stepping into the fire anyway is the truest form of courage. That is a massive life lesson we can all carry. Real bravery is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward even when your very soul is shaking. They attempt a quiet dinner, but the meal tastes like dry ash before the coming storm. Adrian attempts to build a bridge of normalcy by talking about house renovations, yet his intense gaze remains fixed on her face, searching for cracks. She quietly asks a devastating question. If things go wrong tomorrow, and he has to end Eric to protect her, will he regret it? Adrian lets the heavy silence hang. He will always regret the violence, but protecting her? Never. Even if it demands absolute bloodshed. He, Cool, never pretends to be a righteous hero, admitting he carries sins that would rot an ordinary soul. He simply tries to be good to the people who matter. Here is a profound life lesson. Sometimes, genuine loyalty means you have to carry the darkest burdens for the ones you truly cherish. She matters to him, meaning he will have zero regrets. Adrian makes it clear he holds zero regrets about eliminating her abuser. An ordinary person would run from a man who treats violence as a basic transaction. Yet Lena feels a bone-deep relief washing over her. No more forced smiles or tiptoeing across broken glass. She confesses she is finally decoding his character. She calls him dangerous, perhaps more terrifying than Eric, but observes his darkness serves a higher purpose. Here is a remarkably simple life lesson. Your underlying intent changes everything about your moral character. They finish dinner in a peaceful calm. When Adrian walks her to her door, a protective warmth radiates from him. He urges her to rest, knowing tomorrow brings a bitter war. But before he turns away, Lena reaches out and grabs his arm. She whispers a profound thank you, grateful he believed she was worth the trouble. You and I know How crushing it feels to think you are a burden. But the mob boss's stone features soften. He tells her she was never trouble, just someone who needed a hand. There is a powerful life lesson here. The right people will never make you feel like you are too much to handle. That night is a feverish nightmare of Eric's toxic grip, eased only by Adrian's promise. Morning leaves her drained. Rosa brings coffee, offering quiet maternal comfort. Lena dresses in simple, fitted clothes so Eric cannot grab her, leaving her facial bruises entirely exposed. It is an act of pure defiance, a silent middle finger to the torment she survived. Downstairs, Dante and Adrian stand ready for war. Adrian outlines the rules of survival like a strategist. She must stay in the light and refuse to let Eric drag her into his darkness. If he loses his temper, walk away. He and Dante will watch every breath. Adrian locks eyes with her, stating she owes that toxic tyrant absolutely nothing. Zero closure. Zero apologies. If Eric asks why she ran, she must say he shattered her. Here is a vital life lesson. You do not owe your abusers a soft landing. They enter the cafe, where Dante sweeps the room with a predator's precision. Eric waits in a corner booth. His face is wrecked from the Mafia beating he earned. With a bruised jaw and a heavy cast, the tyrant who dictated her reality now looks pathetically small. He stands up, his hand shaking, finally diminished by his own sins. Lena forces her trembling legs forward. She slides into the booth, locking eyes with her abuser without blinking. An absolute alpha move. Eric mutters that she looks good, his voice ragged. She stares through him, coldly declaring she is finally safe. He mocks her for hiding behind a mob boss. Lena meets his scorn with steel, stating she calls it surviving. You and I know this manipulative playbook. Eric leans in, swearing he never meant to hurt her, begging to fix their marriage. But Lena is an unyielding fortress. She tells him he is broken in a way that destroys everyone around him. Here is a harsh life lesson. You cannot heal a toxic demon with pure love. She spent 2 agonizing years trying, and it was never enough. Now she is dropping the dead weight to reclaim her life. She looks the tyrant in the eye, declaring walking away was her best move. Eric drops his voice into that sickeningly intimate tone he used to reel her back. He begs, promising to change, pleading not to abandon what they built. The audacity is staggering. She snaps back, asking what exactly they built. A marriage where she slept on the couch to survive. A life of painting over bruises and inventing lies about a limp she is completely finished. Instantly, his mask of fake repentance shatters, exposing his boiling rage. He hisses she is only leaving him for Castellano, trying to twist his monstrous actions into her betrayal. Here is a critical life lesson. Master manipulators always play the bleeding victim when cornered. She firmly states this is strictly about his violence, letting his pathetic begging fall flat. She stares with chilling calm. The papers are filed, they are done. Eric loses his grip. His hand shoots across the table, viciously digging into her wrist as he growls she belongs to him. Instantly, Adrian rises like a lethal predator, but Lena raises her free hand, commanding the mob boss to hold his ground. This is her battlefield. She demands Eric let go. He sneers, asking if her Mafia boyfriend will put her in the hospital next. She leans forward and whispers the ultimate mic drop. He should be terrified, because the only reason he is still breathing is that she asked Adrian not to end him, and she violently yanks her arm free. Here is a vital life lesson. Never mistake a survivor's mercy for weakness. She drops a final warning. If he ever comes near her again, he is finished. Not a threat, but cold reality. He is left utterly stunned. Observe this psychological shift. You can pinpoint the exact second Eric's manipulative brain short-circuits. He looks at Lena, expecting the terrified victim he created. Instead, he finds a woman made of iron, unfazed by his aggression. His arrogance crumbles into a pathetic whisper, asking if she hates him. Her response is absolute ice. She does not hate him. She simply does not care anymore. No fear, no residual emotion. She calls him out for being a broken man, weaponizing his own trauma, ordering him to sign the papers and leave. Eric attempts one last hollow flex, asking what happens if he refuses. She hits him with the coldest reality check imaginable. Then you die. Adrian steps up, embodying the ultimate authority of a mafia boss, and guides her out. The profound life lesson here: the true opposite of love is not hate, but absolute indifference. Stick with me, because this is where the tension breaks the scale. They are barely out the door when Eric yells that it is not over. Adrian stops dead. He turns around, and we finally witness why this man is feared as the most dangerous boss in the underworld. It is not about chaotic violence. It is the dead calm, pitch black promise in his eyes, a silent vow to burn the city to ash to protect her. Adrian's voice drops into a lethal baritone. He informs Eric that it is permanently over, and if he fails to understand that, Adrian will end him right there. Eric instantly deflates, his false bravado evaporating. Back in the safety of the car, Lena's adrenaline crashes. Her body starts violently shaking. Adrian softly tells her she did an amazing thing by walking away. Here is the truth. Sometimes, facing your darkest nightmare takes every ounce of bravery you have left in the tank. In the quiet of the vehicle, Adrian shifts into protector mode. He gently tells her she is processing massive stress and reminds her to breathe. Lena is shivering, wrapping her arms around herself as if her bones are splintering. Then, the psychological dam breaks. She begins sobbing, purging 2 agonizing years of repressed trauma. Adrian immediately kills the engine. He pulls her into his solid chest, allowing her to collapse into his warmth. He rubs her back, using his deep voice to anchor her, repeating that he has her and she is finally safe. For the first time, she actually believes it. They sit there for 20 minutes while she cries it all out, leaving tear stains on his expensive shirt. What is the final life lesson? Holding on to your silent pain forever will only destroy you. Sometimes, you have to completely fall apart before you can begin to rebuild. Lena wipes her face, the quiet shame of survival washing over her. Adrian offers a monogrammed handkerchief, a small, tangible piece of order in her chaotic reality. He tells her the tears are earned, a release after holding the dam for so long. The drive back is a silent study in trauma. Adrian serves as her temporary anchor, but the mind of a survivor rarely rests. Lena's thoughts spiral, fixated on how Eric looked at her not as a human being, but as stolen property. We need to look closely at this dynamic. Toxic individuals will systematically burn your entire world to ashes, only to complain that the smoke is stinging their eyes. Back at the estate, true peace remains an illusion. Healing does not begin the moment you are safe. It begins when you realize the fire was never your fault. The silence of the estate does not soothe Lena, it suffocates her. She paces the floorboards, driven downward by the restless ghost of her trauma. In the heavy shadows of his office, Adrian sits like a sovereign burdened by his own crown. The news he delivers is a psychological strike. Eric has weaponized the system, filing a police report that paints himself as the terrified victim. It is a classic inversion of reality, threatening the precarious balance of the syndicate. Lena feels the fragile glass of her hope shatter. Adrian's voice turns to granite as he outlines the necessity of their next move. You simply cannot negotiate with an obsession built on control. The lesson we find here is grim but necessary. When dealing with those who seek your destruction, peace requires you to stop compromising and start preparing for the inevitable war. Lena collapses into a heavy leather chair, the weight of the underworld pressing against her chest. She asks what these next steps entail. Adrian, shedding the mask of a protector to reveal the architect of violence beneath, speaks of the permanent kind. The syndicate logic is brutally simple. When an enemy escalates, the narrative only ends one way. He wants her braced for the reality that Eric might finally suffocate on his own arrogance. Adrian asks for a terrible grace, begging her not to despise him for the blood that might spill. Lena's mind drifts to the countless souls who vanished into the dark. She promises not to hate him, but pleads for a bloodless path first. Protecting your inner peace often demands a harsh truth. You must step aside and let toxic people fall into the very abyss they dug with their own hands. Desperation colors her voice as she negotiates, pleading for legal remedies. Adrian stares into the velvet black of the night, warning that the system is already failing her. The divorce is paralyzed. Eric's lawyers claim coercion, weaponizing the law to tether her indefinitely. The battle will drain her for months, unless they pay the architect of her suffering $50,000 to disappear. Lena recoils at the profound injustice of rewarding a monster. But Adrian operates on the cold mathematics of survival. He asks if her ultimate liberation is worth the ransom. She weeps for the principle of it, but there is a vital truth here. Sometimes being right is a poor substitute for being free. You have to recognize when paying the toll is the only way to finally cross the bridge and leave the darkness behind. She fights fiercely for the principle. How does a man who spent 2 years destroying her spirit walk away with a prize? Adrian steps into her space, his presence grounding the room. He reframes the entire transaction. They are not rewarding Eric. They are rendering him entirely irrelevant. Listen, you and I both know the seductive gravity of revenge. The desire to see an abuser broken is a human instinct. Yet, Adrian argues that true victory is a quiet room. If cash buys her future without severing a life, it is an absolute triumph. His logic is an icy blade cutting through her righteous anger. She surrenders, whispering to make the offer. The speed at which Eric accepts the cash is the final insult. It proves a bitter reality. The people who break us are rarely complex villains. They're often just hollow shells motivated by the cheapest of desires. $50,000. That was the precise valuation of her liberation. Eric signed away his grand obsession in a matter of seconds, agreeing to vanish like smoke. This moment echoed with victory, yet Lena feels nothing but a cavernous void. 2 years of psychological warfare traded away for the price of a mid-size vehicle. The ease with which she was discarded cuts far deeper than any physical bruise. Adrian finds her sitting like a statue in the shadowed gardens. She grieves for the illusion that her suffering meant something, that there was a wounded heart beneath his rage. He sold her out without a single glance back. Let this be a lasting lesson. The toxic figures we try to heal never truly valued our light. You must stop pouring your absolute best into a black hole, expecting a dawn that will never arrive. Staring into the endless dark, she asks the question that haunts every survivor. What does this transactional ending say about her actual worth? Adrian does not let the silence linger for a fraction of a second. His response is a definitive strike against her self-doubt. It merely proves that Eric was never worthy of standing in her presence. The money was never a reflection of her value. It was simply the cost of pest control. When doubt still clouds her eyes, Adrian locks his gaze onto hers. He tells her she is worth every dangerous risk and every syndicate complication. Eric was simply too fractured to comprehend the treasure he held. Hearing those words begins to rewrite the damaged code in her mind. Here is a truth to carry with you. Your intrinsic value is never defined by those who are too blind, selfish, and profoundly broken to perceive it. She offers a fragile thank you, grateful to finally be seen as a human rather than a possession. The harsh lines of the Mafia boss soften. Adrian confesses she was never a charity case. Pulling her from the wreckage has been the only meaningful act in his violent life. In that singular breath, the boundary between them dissolves. The air grows dense, charged with a tension that transcends the dynamic of protector and victim. She whispers his name, but the vulnerability terrifies him. The armor slams back into place. He rises abruptly, retreating behind his authority. With the divorce finalizing, she must map out her own destiny. The prospect of starting over is deeply terrifying. Yet, the destruction of your old life is not an ending. A blank canvas is the most extraordinary gift the universe can provide. He reminds her that she finally possesses agency, the very right that was stolen from her. As Adrian disappears, Lena remains in the garden, suspended in the vast purgatory between a traumatic history and an unwritten future. For 2 agonizing years, her existence was defined by pure survival. She mastered the art of shrinking. Now, she faces an equally terrifying challenge. She must remember how to simply exist. The following week dissolves into a blur. Eric collects his ransom and vanishes. The gavel falls, and the legal chains shatter. Yet the anticipated euphoria never arrives. There is only a profound, echoing numbness. I want you to really think about this. When you have spent your life running from a burning building, the absolute hardest part of survival is learning how to stand still once the fire is out. In the aftermath, Adrian pulls a masterful disappearing act. The syndicate leader begins ghosting her, burying himself in underworld politics to avoid their shared space. Is he reinforcing his emotional barricades or granting her room to breathe? The ambiguity leaves Lena unmoored. Seeking an anchor, she returns to her old neighborhood cafe, desperate to touch the fabric of normal life. Her friend Maria embraces her with fierce loyalty, but when pressed about her grand vision for the future, Lena draws a complete blank. She has her freedom, but prolonged trauma has rewired her psychology. She confesses she has entirely forgotten the mechanics of dreaming. Recovering from absolute devastation is not a cinematic montage. It is a grueling process where you must meticulously relearn how to be a person from scratch. Maria offers a piece of grounded wisdom, urging her to start with the smallest choices. She advises Lena to reclaim her narrative by finding joy. Rather than living as a passive observer, the ability to choose is the ultimate assertion of power. Fueled by this, Lena marches back to the heavily guarded estate. She finds Adrian barricaded behind his desk, yet the moment she knocks, he drops everything. Taking a fortifying breath, Lena delivers her declaration of independence. She is done running. She intends to build her life in the city, but with one crucial condition. Holding his dark gaze, she announces she is moving out. She needs her own sanctuary to truly rebuild. True healing demands a frightening leap. Eventually, you have to step out of fortified safe zone and face the unpredictable wilderness entirely on your own. For the first time, the untouchable Don is visibly shaken. Adrian insists she can stay indefinitely, his voice cracking with desperate panic. But let us look at the psychology of this moment. If Lena remains wrapped in the impenetrable armor of a crime syndicate, her strength will atrophy. She explains that his protection is suffocating her growth. He argues she has proven her resilience, but Lena knows external validation is useless if she cannot believe it herself. She cannot build self-trust hiding behind guards. The sprawling office falls dead silent. Adrian asks if his wealth makes her feel indebted. It was never about the money. She refuses to play the role of the tragic damsel forever. To discover who you truly are, you must bravely strip away the very armor that kept you alive during the darkest times. Let's examine the anatomy of a quiet heartbreak. Adrian swallows the bitter pill of her departure, his face a mask of absolute stoicism. He stares out the dark window, granting her the space to build an empire of her own making. But then the mask slips. He locks eyes with her and delivers a promise that alters the gravity in the room. Moving out, he swears, does not mean she walks alone. If any shadow dares to touch her, he will materialize. The sheer weight of his loyalty leaves Lena gasping for air. In her frantic sprint toward independence, she completely forgot the warmth of his orbit. She was going to miss this dangerous man terribly. Sometimes you and I do the exact same thing. We push away the very hands that offer us sanctuary, just to prove we can weather the storm. The tragedy is that neither knows how to linger in softness. Lena whispers a trembling word of gratitude. She thanks him for seeing her true worth and for standing as her shield. For a fleeting second, his armor drops. Adrian softly swears she was always his highest priority. But almost instantly, the fortress walls rise back up. He shuffles his sterile paperwork and coolly offers to introduce her to local landlords. It is a dismissal disguised as a courtesy. Lena rises, suddenly crushed by the weight of her own choices. 2 weeks later, she signs the lease on a modest apartment built around heavy locks. Gaining your freedom is a monumental victory, but stepping into that quiet space reminds us that the pursuit of true independence is often the coldest walk imaginable. Maria arrives to haul boxes, forcing cheerful energy into the room, while Lena simply stares at the blank canvas of her new existence. The quiet breaks when Dante arrives, carrying heavy crates of supplies. But the absence of one specific man rings louder than a gunshot. There are 0 messages from Adrian. Dante merely states the boss wants her secure. By nightfall, the silence of the apartment becomes deafening. Lena sits on a worn couch with cheap takeout, suffocated by the very freedom she fought to win. She questions if walking away was a fatal error. That first week is a punishing trial. There are no bodyguards in the hall, no dangerous protector waiting in the shadows to scare away her ghosts. She is learning the hardest lesson of trauma recovery. You must do the heavy lifting. In psychological terms, she is constructing an entirely new identity from scratch. Lena throws herself back into the rhythm of the restaurant, offering bright smiles to strangers who have no idea she just walked away from a Mafia kingpin. There is a strange protective comfort in letting a simple apron disguise her massive internal wounds. Maria watches her carefully, always probing for cracks. Lena insists she is finally discovering her own value without a man dictating her movements. Yet the midnight hours tell a darker story. Her sleeping mind constantly summons the phantom of her abusive ex-husband, Eric. But every time she jolts awake in a cold sweat, her eyes find the heavy iron deadbolts on her door. Building a secure fortress is the ultimate declaration of personal power. We have to acknowledge the invisible safety net Adrian left behind. If her ex-husband ever steps out of line, the Don has green-lit his complete destruction. Fear keeps the monster at bay, But as 3 brutal weeks crawl by, the silence from Adrian becomes its own kind of torture. Dante makes casual appearances, claiming the boss is buried in syndicate politics, yet he slips and reveals that Adrian asks about her every single day. Lena tries to swallow the lie that this absolute distance is necessary for her healing. The reality is far more painful. She misses his quiet authority. She misses the impenetrable shield he provided when the world felt entirely too sharp. All too often, we sabotage the most genuine connections simply because our hearts are still too bruised to see it. The isolation shatters completely when Rosa marches through the door one late afternoon, carrying a warm meal and a gaze that sees right through the deception. She immediately calls out Lena for her stubborn pride. Lena attempts to play the innocent victim, but Rosa has survived 8 years in the shadow of a crime family. She can spot a bleeding heart from a mile away. Rosa effortlessly dismantles the facade of independent detachment. When Lena mutters that the situation is complicated, Rosa delivers a profound truth. You do not need a flawless history to be worthy of happiness. You cannot put your entire existence on hold until your trauma is perfectly resolved. Lena goes entirely on the defensive. Healing, as we clearly see, is rarely a quiet or peaceful process. The defensive walls finally collapse and Lena openly weeps. She confesses that she has no idea who she is without the familiar weight of suffering anchoring her to the ground. How do you rebuild a life when your mind is still pacing inside a cage? Rosa offers a brutally simple solution, demanding absolute honesty. She explains that carving out your independence does not require a vow of total isolation. Yes, the crime boss pulled her from the wreckage, but he stayed because he values the woman she is, not the tragedy she represents. It is entirely acceptable to care for him in return. Using past trauma as a permanent shield is a tragedy of its own making. Our fierce obsession with projecting unbreakable strength can blind us completely to the genuine grace standing in front of us. I want you to picture the sheer panic of reaching out across the void. Lena picks up her phone 3 separate times before finding the nerve to press call. Adrian answers on the very first ring. Throwing caution away, she invites him to her territory for dinner. The silence stretches out so agonizingly long that she almost hangs up. Finally, his low voice crackles over the speaker, securing the plans for 7. She spends the entire afternoon scrubbing her modest apartment, desperate to normalize their chaotic dynamic. Right on time, the underworld kingpin stands at her door, clutching a bottle of wine. He looks surprisingly vulnerable, like a wolf stepping out onto thin ice. She whispers for him to enter. Confessing your own heart is the most terrifying battle you will ever fight. They sit across from each other at her tiny kitchen table, exchanging painfully ordinary conversations about the weather, both of them starving for normalcy. Once the wine bottle is finally emptied, Lena shatters the quiet illusion. Looking him directly in the eyes, she admits her failure. Adrian raises a dark eyebrow, waiting. She confesses that she spent the last month fighting invisible ghosts, so obsessed with proving her independence that she forgot how to actually live. Stripping away her armor, she admits she misses him entirely. She misses feeling seen as a human being rather than a broken charity case. Adrian suddenly exhales sharply and cuts her off. He insists she is merely confused. True vulnerability requires stripping away your defenses, and that is a terrifying exposure. The tension in the small apartment threatens to suffocate them both, but Lena refuses to retreat. She looks at him and declares she is ready to try, not out of a distorted sense of gratitude, but because she actually admires the person she becomes when he is near. She is officially done running away. Adrian, a man who commands the violent underworld, tries to push her back. He reminds her he is a literal criminal, a man who navigates life with his fists, bringing danger to everything he touches. But Lena does not flinch. She reaches across the table, wrapping her fingers around his hand, and states that this is her choice to make. The stoic boss completely breaks. The absolute bravest thing you can ever do is plant your feet, stop running, and embrace something fiercely real. For months, Adrian viewed himself strictly as the getaway driver in the wreckage of her life. It never occurred to him that she might actually look at him and see a partner. Lena whispers that he was the only soul who paused when the rest of the world turned a blind eye. He offered absolute protection without ever demanding possession. When she quietly calls herself a ruined thing, Adrian fiercely cuts her off. He tells her she was never broken, merely bent out of shape by a tragic string of circumstances. She asks him to stay, not as a savior, but as an equal. He pulls her in, and their first kiss is silent, heavy, and profound. Two battered survivors finding a spark in the dark. You only need a person who reminds you that your core was never truly broken in the first place. We have to understand that psychological healing is never a straight line. Lena maintains her fierce independence and her humble job, but she finally learns how to lean on Adrian when the shadows grow too long. Reaching for a lifeline does not equate to surrendering your freedom. And the hardened Mafia boss? He begins to slowly unlock the still vault of his chest, exposing his own violent history. It is definitely no pristine fairy tale. They clash constantly over her stubborn pride and his deeply ingrained instinct to solve minor issues with brute force. But somehow, these two damaged souls make it work. A beautiful life does not mean completely avoiding the jagged edges. It simply means finding a partner who is willing to sweep up the broken glass right alongside you. Let us look closely at what it means to truly rebuild a broken life. Lena does not just want to survive. She wants to become a lighthouse for women drowning in the exact nightmare she escaped. The Mafia boss quietly pays her entire tuition, showing her that true independence does not mean refusing a hand to hold. 1 year after fleeing the psychological prison Eric built, she moves into Adrian's home entirely by choice. Standing at a wedding later, she remembers weeping on a freezing bathroom floor. Now, the ghost of Eric barely registers. She simply hopes he conquers his own demons. The real lesson here is profound. True power is not about revenge. It is looking back at the architect of your destruction and feeling nothing but absolute unshakable peace. For Lena, the shadow of her abuser is fading into nothingness. The true psychological battle she faces now is learning how to trust the ground beneath her feet. She is slowly accepting that she is worthy of a beautiful life. The pivotal moment arrives on an ordinary Tuesday, no dramatic speeches. They are simply eating dinner when Adrian looks up and asks her to marry him. Lena studies this dangerous man who loves her with absolute fierce devotion. And she says yes, but she establishes boundaries immediately, separate bank accounts and an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Adrian simply laughs that deep, rumbling laugh and agrees without hesitation. The takeaway here is vital. You never have to be flawless to deserve profound love, but you must demand to step into it as an equal partner. You and I have watched this dynamic shift from rescue to true partnership. Adrian whispers that she saved herself, and he merely unlocked the door. Lena corrects him softly. They saved each other. He offered a fortress, and she gave this underworld figure a genuine anchor to humanity. Their wedding stands as a defiant monument against the darkness they both survived. Dante raises a glass to how Lena melted the frost around their leader's heart. Standing at the altar, Lena is overwhelmed by a profound sense of hope. This is not the frantic energy of survival, but the steady pulse of a victor. The lesson is undeniable. No matter how suffocating your history feels, you hold the absolute power to rewrite your narrative and finally breathe free. This moment represents the absolute pinnacle of character development. Lena finally recognizes her own value, understanding that her traumatic past served as the anvil that forged her into unbreakable steel. Adrian holds her and asks what occupies her mind. She admits she is simply marveling at her own evolution. When he asks if she carries regrets, her response is a masterclass in acceptance. She has none. Every agonizing night was a stepping stone leading directly to his door. She would not trade a single second of the agony. He kisses her forehead, knowing she will rescue countless others. Take note of this essential truth. Crashing into the absolute lowest rock bottom is often the singular event that teaches you the vast difference between merely surviving and actually being alive. Lena tells him with unwavering conviction that she refuses to be a bystander who looks away from suffering. Adrian murmurs into the dark that she already is a beacon. Her thoughts drift to the invisible women crying on cold tiles, convinced society has discarded them. She knows she cannot rescue the entire world, but she can be the open door Adrian was for her. 3 years after her escape, Lena opens a physical sanctuary. It is a safety net designed to catch people before they shatter on the concrete. This brings us to a profound realization. The ultimate responsibility of surviving tragedy is what you do next. You must take the wreckage of your old life and construct a ladder. Your deepest scars can become the exact map that guides someone else out of the inferno. This sanctuary is a quiet store where the broken can speak without fear. Behind the scenes, Adrian pulls strings in the underworld, financing a network of lawyers and safe houses. The first person to walk in is a terrified girl covered in bruises, convinced her story is over. Lena hands her warm coffee and simply listens, offering zero hollow cliches. When the girl asks if escape is a reality, Lena holds her gaze. She shares the brutal truth. The path out will be agonizing, but she will never walk through the flames alone. Lena remembers her own desperate gamble of stepping into a Mafia boss's car. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes, making a terrifying leap of faith is the absolute only way you will ever find solid ground again. Let us appreciate the brilliance of this resolution. Lena clawed her way out of a personal hell and constructed a reality defined by genuine affection. She has transformed into a guiding light for those trapped in the shadows. The most beautiful part? It has nothing to do with revenge. Her toxic ex is likely still out there, consumed by his own victim complex. Instead of retaliation, Lena took all that jagged trauma and melted it down into a shield to protect the vulnerable. Lying beside Adrian, she realizes she denied a monster the pen to write her final chapter. She thanks Adrian for recognizing a shattered soul when she had forgotten how to exist. Here is the ultimate life lesson. The most profound victory you can achieve over evil is ensuring the cycle of trauma officially ends with you. While they sleep in a fortress built from the ashes of their past, the city hums with quiet tragedies. Somewhere tonight, another woman is staring into a mirror. She touches fresh bruises, running that horrifying mental calculus, weighing the danger of staying against the unknown terror of running away. But when the sun rises, She might find the courage to walk into Lena's office and ask if there is a way out. Lena will be right there, ready to hand over the exact lifeline Adrian once extended to her. This brings us to the final life lesson of our story. Surviving the absolute worst chapter of your existence is merely the first step. The lasting victory is the beautiful empire you manage to construct after the storm finally clears. Lena is not running anymore. She is finally living,